Hello and welcome to the 500th episode of the Embodiment Podcast. To celebrate the occasion and thank you for being with us on this embodiment journey, we wanted to offer a gift to everyone listening. If you go to the description and click on the link, you will receive Mark's Embodiment Moving Beyond Mindfulness book, 50 plus videos from embodiment legends, and a $100 shop voucher to use at embodimentunlimited.com. Thanks again for being part of this conversation and for helping the term and practices of embodiment become recognised, respected and commonplace. In this episode, Mark is being interviewed by Ranko Ceric, a mentee who has been working with Mark for a few years now. Mark talks about his podcast experiences and what he's learnt and his thoughts for the near future. Enjoy.
Okay, on the show today, it's me, motherfuckers, on the show. It's episode 500. How the fuck did that happen? Normally, every 100 episodes, we turn the tables and usually a friend, a student, a colleague interviews me. And I'm back, who was recently on as a guest. My old friend, colleague, Ranko, will be interviewing me today. So, Ranko, nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you. Quite a weird switch. But actually, like first time on the podcast a few months ago and now on the other side. So yeah, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's just a coincidence. I thought, who knows me quite well and has known me for a few years and knows the work well. So it kind of made sense to get you on. And from my point of view, it's happy to chat. I'm a little bit coldy today. I've got a bit of a cold. And I got to bed at 2 a.m. last night. And I'm far too old for that these days. So yeah, for all the right reasons. But now today I'm a little worse for wear. So I will struggle through.
Okay, we're going to manage somehow. So if I may start, actually start with this turning of the roles. As I'm actually sort of diving into this kind of podcasting world, and I haven't been listening to them a lot before, and you sort of put me in. The thing that I would like to actually explore first is when you were starting 500 episodes before, what were the biggest challenges and biggest learnings of just starting and going on?
Yeah, I mean, it was a few years ago now, I think maybe more than 4 years. And the learnings have been huge, mostly, different topics, right? So there's the interviewing skill. I've got a little bit of practice at that now. I didn't used to. So I've definitely learned a lot about that. I've learned a lot about different kind of guests and what they're doing in an interview, because it's not it's not like a normal conversation. There's several sort of categories. I mean, obviously, a lot of it's just learning about embodiment, and that's still the main reason I do it, and thinking out loud and just talking to cool people, which is quite a privilege, really. So a lot of the learnings are about that. Who do I want to speak to? Right down to interrupting guests, how to make people a bit more authentic if they're sort of got a bit of a pre-recorded speech, listening skills. There's loads I could say, really. So I'd probably want to get a bit more specific before I could answer properly.
Yeah, how was it actually at the beginning being authentic yourself while attaining other guests? So keeping your position while looking into their views.
Yeah, well, I've always been fairly chatty, so it wasn't that weird, really. I mean, you don't get nervous, I find, on a podcast quite so much as like a talk in front of an audience, because you're just talking to someone. So it's pretty chill. Like, it's not so different than if me and you were sitting in a coffee shop in London or whatever, right? It wouldn't be so different. So in that way, it's not too bad. There's some sense there's an audience there. I always think of it, I want to learn something from the guest. So I'm sort of selfishly motivated, as it were. I want to give value to the audience. So I'm imagining an audience out there. I'm around enough of my students to have a sort of composite image of what that might be, who might be listening. And I want to give them something useful. And I want the guest to come across well. Like I feel like I'm not Kathy Newman, or that guy from Channel 4 who always attacks people. Like, I feel like giving people the benefit of the doubt, being basically friendly to them. And it means I can critique their ideas, but basically giving them a friendly platform where they can present the best side of themselves. That feels to me ethical. So effectively, I'm serving 3 different people simultaneously. And I don't just want to give them a platform to advertise their shit if it's not going to be helpful to the audience. And if I'm not personally engaged in learning, then, you know, I'm not so in the conversation. But equally, if I just say, well, actually, can you help me with my latest problem with my wife or something? You know, like that's just a bit selfish. I'm not really serving them or the audience anymore. So it's sort of like I've got 3 people in mind the whole time, and I try and keep that balanced.
So when we go to the guests, and I know that you've got quite a unique approach to the embodiment, not so much drilling into one-sidedness of being a yoga or whatever, but really covering the huge field and trying to drill into different, even more exotic things. So what would be the weirdest field that you've covered in the podcast with the guests?
Well, we had a Finnish researcher on who was really interesting and just did really kind of odd research as to what I'm just thinking of. I mean, so many episodes, it's hard to think of. I mean, we've definitely had some people from kind of various sexual modalities, you know, kind of kink stuff. I don't think those things are particularly weird, but someone might. I tend to avoid anything that's too sort of esoterically orientated, you know, like magic powers stuff. And I tend to avoid sort of too conspiratorial, you know, ancient alien from Egypt, from Mars. You know, I tend to avoid that sort of stuff. So I regard it all as fairly normal now, but that might just be that I'm too deep in the embodiment world.
So now that you mentioned kink, how would you, well, I guess to some people it can be like kink, embodiment. So how would you connect it?
Those guys know loads about embodiment. Let's take consent culture, which you've done coaching work with me. That's a really important part of coaching, is that it's consent there. The kink guys know the most about that of anyone. Because if you don't, someone chokes to death. You've got to get that right. And you can do kink in a disembodied way and just playing out trauma patterns, and people do quite often. However, there are really informed people, and they're playing with power dynamics in a really potentially very healing way, for example. So I love having kinky guests on. And I also just have fun. Like my inner 10-year-old just finds the whole thing silly when I have some dominatrix on, you know. So I just have a laugh with it. I don't take it too seriously.
So you basically mentioned like 2 aspects. Now that let's just take this kink thing because it's sort of, let's say, exotic extreme. So, and you mentioned it in a both ways, as being something that is a projection of trauma, something like people just going through some stuff, not really, and also a healing modality. So in what way could this kind of thing work as a healing
I'm not
modality?
an expert on this, but I mean, I'm an occasional practitioner of the fairly sort of lighter end of the spectrum. And I've noticed even with partners, one partner will say, you know, can I call you daddy? And it will just feel fun and light and healthy. And another partner will say that and it will just creep me out and I won't feel good in my body. And I'll be like, I'd rather you didn't. And then usually if I get to know them, the reasons for that become clear later on. Like if I get to know their histories and their childhood and blah, blah, blah. Or, you know, I'm just giving that as an example, right? It feels a bit vulnerable sharing kind of very personal examples. I've heard the same thing from other people in kink. It's not so much the act, it's what's driving it, how much consciousness there is around it. Is it just an attempt to numb out? And that could be a positive thing, you know, like kind of sometimes we need conscious dissociation, which sounds like an oxymoron. You know, or is it actually just this person needs treatment and they're using intensity is the only way they can feel anything anymore? And, you know, they're super numb and they actually need trauma therapy. And for me, I just say this less as an expert and more as a sort of occasional recreational practitioner. It feels different. The intentionality behind it makes my instinctive kind of ethical radar go off in some cases and not others. And then there's all the normal stuff we talked about around consent and boundaries and great communication skills. I've got one friend of mine who's very much into shibari, the kind of roping people up.
Yeah.
You might know the guy, and I won't name him because I'm not sure how public it is. And you obviously have to have pretty good communication skills doing that. And that's going to bring up a lot in terms of vulnerability and different classic emotional themes. So I think in the future, kind of, kink, sex worker, therapist will be a profession. I think that will be and it sort of is becoming, I'm told, in some areas like New York and stuff.
Yeah, that sounds like really interesting sort of development of things. But nowadays, a lot of things that like a few years ago seem totally crazy nowadays are sort of accepted.
Well, psychedelics. I didn't, like when the podcast started, I wouldn't talk about my own psychedelic experience.
Yeah, now it's normally accepted
now it's totally
part
normal. So I mean, we are in an extreme culture that is both a wonderful opportunity and also utterly decadent. And what that means is that things are getting more extreme. And even psychedelics have got more extreme. I remember when it was a big deal to have done mushrooms, and now it's like, unless you had a fucking shamanic ayahuascan toad poke out your eyes or something, it's not, anything. So that's kind of interesting. Even in the 5 years I've done the podcast, we could say, well, what's changed in that time around embodiment, right? Like I've changed. I've had a whole very different life experience. And the world's changed and certain sensitivities have sort of kicked off, as well. So apparently we've got some bad reviews on iTunes now. So if anyone wants to give us some nice reviews, please do. But it's that's sensitivities to some of my humor, for example. So that's interesting. And also the sort of figure I am in embodiment has changed.
Mm-hmm.
So 5 years ago, I might have been known kind of locally or in a very niche in the coaching field, perhaps, as a decent trainer of embodiment coaches. And then things like the conference, I happen to be wearing the T-shirt today, quite coincidentally, kicked off. And that meant that all of a sudden I was positioned as a sort of a player, a somebody for whatever the stats worth. And I think very little, but, in people's minds, it can be worth a lot. And that changes the nature of conversations because now there's a kudos to the platform. It's like the first 20 guests were just friends of mine, and now it's like we're approaching, like at the moment we're approaching trying to get on the podcast Rick Rubin, for example, who's one of the top music producers in all of
Beastie Boys and stuff.
Yeah, he's produced Pearl Jam and Guns N' Roses and crazy big bands, and he's also an embodiment guy, it turns out. So we're trying to get him on the show, and it hasn't been secured, so I don't want to say, but it's like there's a decent chance, So the reach we have now, and actually we just gave, I think listeners might be interested in the practicalities, like how we do it. There's a woman called Zeba who's an embodiment teacher. She was my PA, but we've now given her a full-time job as just doing the podcast. Sorry, not full-time, but it's her only job for the company, but it's not full-time. She's a mum of 4, so she needs the hours for other things. And she spends a lot of time just messaging people. It's quite difficult to get a guest on unless you know them well. And there might be 20 emails beforehand about, and then she's like, well, what topics do you want to talk about? And, make sure you've got good Wi-Fi. And because occasionally people turn up on their camera somewhere, and she's been trying to help me get better mics and increase our sound quality. Because I was traveling a lot and the mic was really crappy in my laptop. So she got me a better mic for that. So hopefully that sounds better now. We've not gone sort of full recording studio style. And we have an editor, but it's very deliberately fairly fast, cheap and dirty, this podcast.
Yeah, no, that's actually, you've got this kind of, I want to get things done modality that is, pushing it through. And the funny thing about the mics, I'm just trying to find the one just for the starting. So sort of. What is said about this kind of changing of perspective as your image actually in this world grew, this pushed to question I had actually. The thing about the conference, so it's, I would say, sort of before and after the conference. Could it be said, like your career and your...
Yeah. I mean, it was an overnight success that took 10 years of work to get there, you know. So there was, like, for example, the conference was built on the podcast because many guests in the conference had already been on the podcast. And the main reason I do the podcast is just to talk to cool people about embodiment. Just that's why I'm seeing it I'm looking at my diary. It's Sunday night now. I'm looking at my diary. I've got 3 podcasts lined up this week. It's one more than normal. We do 2 a week normally. And I'm like, great. I really like seeing it in my diary, you know? And then the strategic reason on top of that is that there are people who won't give you an hour of their time, but they will if it's a podcast. And the podcast's a great door opener into maybe doing a course together or being on a summit. So the podcast really enabled the Embodiment Conference because all of a sudden, by the time the conference happened, I think we're on episode 200 or something, there was 200 people I could ask to be speakers. You know, the second conference was actually 2 conferences. Most people didn't catch the first one. It's like 15,000 people. The first one's much smaller. And yeah, my career, I'd say the 2 big points and turning points for me is the Embodiment Conference, which is nearly 3 years ago now, 2.5 years ago, and going to Ukraine last year, the Sane Ukraine project. Like, they were the 2 big change points for me. And they were both big successes in utterly different ways. And they both had quite big costs as well. Both of them were psychologically very difficult in the aftermath.
So let's say, how did the conference, and as like a big change in how people perceived you, how did it change you?
The scale you're working on impacts a certain weightiness you have. And partly that's bullshit and just people's perception and nonsense and ego. But there's another way in which it is real. So sort of being in charge of a country the size of Luxembourg for a few weeks, essentially, you know, in numbers terms, it does something to you. It does something to you. It forces you to depth or to grow up or something else. And in many ways, I wasn't ready for it, but we never are, you know. Even though I had a 10-year run up to it, you know, we'd done a conference 2 years before and all sorts of other events. I think the other one is there was a lot of sort of pretty unpleasant takedown stuff afterwards, which I don't want to give too much energy to, but it was deeply unpleasant and in many ways very, very unfair. Just really people parasitically trying to go off the back of the conference. Some of it was just the spirit of the times, you know, different things were going on in society. Some of it was just the social justice kind of thing and kind of was hitting a peak. And I think happily people are a bit more skeptical about it now, let's say. And so there's a few things going on in society. As soon as you're at a certain size, you become a target because you're worth taking down. Because now it's noble and brave to attack you. When you're the little guy, not so much. And that was deeply unpleasant. Like one of the worst things I've ever had in my life. Really unpleasant. Really unpleasant.
How did you actually push through this kind of, what are the tools, what was maybe helpful for people who are facing maybe smaller but similar kind of...
Well, I've actually since, because I really looked it up and I wanted to figure out where it came from, so I kind of looked up the roots of it, like philosophically. I looked up the psychology, there's a trauma element to it, which makes it a bit more forgivable, you know. There's political element to it, there's all these kind of elements to it. So I really researched it because at first I was just like, why are these people doing this? This is mean, you know. And then some of it is also I'd made mistakes. I also want to hold my hands up and say, hey, some of this was my pathology, some of this was my mistake, some of this was, you know, stuff I can take responsibility for and learn from and be a better leader from. So I want to hold that up too. That's genuinely. And since then, I've helped a lot of people who have come to me often quietly and said, hey, I'm having a problem. Because it turns out that as soon as you're on a stage, it's going to happen now. There's no getting out. Now, some personalities like mine might draw it more than other personalities. But even the meekest, sweetest, kindest, you know, I'm a bad boy who shoots his mouth off. I expect to get into a certain amount of trouble, you know. But there's other people that have come to me who I just went, oh, my God, even this guy they've gone after? Yeah. So, yeah, I think understanding it helps. We've got a negativity bias, so it's really easy to listen to people who hate you. And at times I just had to spend time with friends and family and people that knew me really well. And I remember one time, I think my therapist just saying, Mark, you're a good man. And I almost cried because I'd been having so many people saying the opposite, that I just needed to hear someone to tell me I was okay. Like, you're okay, mate, you know?
Yeah, the fact that actually this number of people telling that like you're bad is actually a small number compared to...
Very small. It's very small. I mean, even with the conference, it's like 99% of people involved loved it, you know? And yes, some speakers were pissed off, but I looked at the percentage, it was less than 1% of the speakers that ever had a problem. And the same with it, you know, never read the comments on YouTube, right? You've got to be a little bit careful about how much you... But really, Buddhists call it guarding the gates of the senses. You've got to be like discipline around that. And you've also got to learn certain skills. Like, I'd say about once a week now, someone comes up to me and says, "Hey, you Mark Walsh." And 50% of the time it's from the conference, 50% of the time it's from other stuff, right? Saying you're great, well. And you just learn the skill of just sort of being a bit gracious and sort of doing a selfie and, you know, signing a book.
Yeah.
Like, hey,
being the person you've grown into, right?
Yeah. 9 out of 10 times they're absolutely fine, and it's a pleasure. And I quite like it when people do it if they're relatively sensitive about it. And most people are all right. But the other thing is, though, you just get a lot of projection. You need a good therapist because the projection involved is just huge. Like, people need a bad guy. You know, there's a bit of a supply and demand issue when it comes to bad guys in the embodiment world, because most of us are sort of nice people. And it's like, sometimes I feel like, really, I'm the best you've got, you know? It's I'm the best bad guy you can find. It's a bit pathetic.
Well, you are sort of different in a way of approaching. There are not so many like who are comfortable with like swearing and stuff like that. So I would say a quite specific approach. Right.
Well, swearing's got more popular over the years. You'll see a lot of personal growth books in W.H. Smith's with F***pay on the front cover now. So, I led the way there. I think there's an anti-woke thing. More and more people are realizing that it's not very... Woke isn't as kind as it pretends to be. And activists maybe are at best damaged people in many cases. So I think people are awake. I was just a bit bleeding edge, let's say, on that. A bit ahead of the curve. You know, there's leading edge and bleeding edge. So you don't want to be too far ahead of the curve. I have a fairly, we could say, sort of masculine style. And my style archetypally is like warrior plus joker. And neither of those archetypes are safe. And there are a lot of people in the embodiment world who have trauma and who don't, that's not what they feel best around. So I can understand why that's not the most common kind of style out there. And the other thing is I'm Anglo. Just most of the people in this field are American. And that's just a different culture. Like, if you go to any summit, their version of diversity will be 3 different colors of American.
Yeah, not quite noticed that. And it doesn't even matter like what kind of education or whatever. It's mostly just let's cover the colors and the genders and stuff. So yeah,
they're the ones you can see. You see. Yeah. So, for example, another one that British people is class. Nobody's interested in that. You know, like that's like, to me, money is the one that really matters. Like, I'm very aware, and one reason I like having something free like the podcast as a free resource. I'm very aware there's a lot of people in England struggling with their bills right now. I don't know what it's like in Croatia, but electricity and food are expensive, and they're not luxuries. So for me, it's like after the conference, I became a bit more conservative because of sort of having money for the first time. You know, that's different. Having this mad lot of projection for the first time. And then recently I've gone a bit more to the left because I'm sort of more like traditional leftist because I've seen more poverty and more people struggling. And I've gone, okay, this is an issue. I mean, here's the thing, right? Any success is always a mixture of talent, hard work, luck, and corruption.
Corruption, yeah, that's very close to where I live.
And every country and every industry is a slightly different combination of those 4 things. And when you have success, you sort of lean into, this talent and hard work, right? Because it's like, not like I came from a lot of privilege, you know what I mean? People say, rich white man or whatever. I'm like, no, my family, it's rough, it's not good. Pretty poor upbringing. So you kind of lean into the conservative side of things. And particularly on the podcast, I'm listening to a lot of stories and you'll see that combination of what got them there. So you have to be sort of some sort of a name or doing something interesting to be on the podcast, right? So some guests I go, you just had a nice education, went to the nice schools, But even then, most people have worked pretty hard. Like a lot of the American guests I have on have really built a brand, have really, written 10 books, they've really gone for it. There's others who are just in the right place at the right time. They happen to be launching a thing and TikTok was there. And then others, it's just because they know people. I mean, like the corruption in the embodiment industry is huge. People doing each other favors, people having their sons and daughters on.
Oh, that's a classic.
God, what kind of
it's so hard to resist. I mean, imagine it's easy from this point, but once like after 15 or 18 years, maybe your son will be, and then it's going to be hard to resist.
Meritocracy is an important thing, but then equally we can't take that out. Like you and Sarah on recently, and your mentees of mine, you're people that I work with, but equally there were mentees I told no to a podcast because they didn't have the experience.
Yeah.
Right? So there were people that I said, no, I'm sorry, you just, I love you, but you haven't been doing this long enough to get on the podcast. So I have had said no to people who I'm quite close to. It's reminded me actually of someone I want to invite. I mean, one thing that might be interesting to people is how, where we get guests from, right?
Actually, yes, because I've seen quite a diverse, even though I didn't listen to nearly close to all of them, but quite a diverse field of from some kind of crazy yoga guy to Shenzhen to really diverse things. And so how do you have some kind of sort of plan of things that you want to cover, or is it more inspiration?
It's pretty chaotic. I'm going to be honest, it's pretty chaotic. So it's mostly just people I want to speak to. And if I'm learning about something, we might have like 3 guests on who are into, I don't know, intuitive eating. Like there was a period where I was researching that for myself, so I just got a bunch of guests on to talk to, right? It could be accidental. Sometimes I bump into someone, I'm like, oh, I haven't seen you in ages. Oh, do you want to come on the podcast? It's like a nice way of catching up with an old friend from people that have been on multiple times, like George Cow, or I'm having Jamie Catto on recently, or Tad Hargrave, or Miles Kessler, who's a friend of mine. These are all like high quality guests, but they come on multiple times just because I want to catch up with them. So, that's corruption.
So much to give. And I know
and they've got so much to give.
All of them personally. So, they're really like a huge well of knowledge. So, really.
And then other people who are like, they're really big names, and like Zeba, who runs the podcast, is saying like, hey, this person will probably get a lot of hits, a lot of downloads. So we track that. And I have to still like them and be interested. I have to respect them. I can't interview someone I don't like. Deepak Chopra, if you're out there, you're never coming on the show. You find.
And when you mentioned Rick Rubin, so how is like this would be like a big step up, right? How is it about going? Like, how do you get this kind of upgrade to this kind of person?
Well, either there's a connection, or you've had a guest on that they know. So, for example, I've been on Chris Williamson's podcast as a guest, and so has Rick Rubin, right? So there's a link. So Zeba will write a personalized message. Personalized is really important, saying, hey, me and Mark love your work. We listen to the following albums that you've done. Like, genuinely, we're not lying. We like the albums, And by the way, you'll see you've got a connection here. Mark's also been on this podcast. Like, me being on the Trigonometry podcast recently opens up a load of guests. Like I'm interviewing someone tomorrow who's a psychologist, who I think he's been on Rogan actually. Like I'm only one step down from the biggest podcast in the world now, essentially. So as long as you're one step away, you've got kind of a link. And usually it's people are promoting something. So let's say they've got a book coming out. We might say, hey, Stephen Porges, it's been a while since we saw you since the conference. Thanks for your support in Ukraine. We see you've got a book coming out. Do you fancy coming back on? And, there's a relationship, there's prehistory there, or it's like, hey, Debs Dana, we've already worked with Stephen Porges. We hear you're one of his top trainers and you're really good. Do you want to come on? So there's those kind of links there. And mostly guests quite enjoy it. Like I've had guests say they quite enjoy being on the show. It's a good chat. Sometimes I get asked by my social media person, Mira, to have someone on because they're big on social media. And that doesn't always work out well. Sometimes they're good and sometimes they're not, is what I've been finding. because you can be quite good on a 1 minute YouTube, Instagram reel.
Yeah, but 1 hour of content is something else.
It's different. You have to be really expert, and sometimes that becomes apparent. But then there are also sort of wild cards. So I'll let Mira just like suggest some random mad yogi to me or something. I'll be like, okay, cool.
Yeah, I've seen the guy. I think.
It was fun. Like I'm like, cool.
So do you do like a kind of research before, or you just jump in and see what's in it, or?
Yeah. So tell you what we don't do is if people suggest themselves for the podcast, like never suggest yourself. I never listen to that. But if someone does suggest a friend or a colleague, and I don't know them, I'll say, send me a podcast they've been on. So I don't do virgins, okay? So usually, like, otherwise they're just a bit nervous or stilted usually.
You did me.
I coached you through it. But even then, I'm like, you've been doing what you've been doing quite a while, so you're pretty comfortable with it. And so usually they have to have done at least one podcast before. And I'll say if they haven't, come back when they have. And I listen to the first 5 minutes of the podcast. And within the first 5 minutes, what I'm listening for is, do I hate them? Because if I do, I don't have them on. Do I just want to vomit when I hear their Valley Girl Californian accent or something, right? Do I think they've basically got something that my audience would find interesting? So there's a guy I've got on tomorrow who's a psychologist called Adam Smith. I just listened to a few of his clips that were suggested on YouTube, thought they were brilliant. I was like, well, my audience, this is really innovative. My audience is going to love this. So I just sent him an invite on Instagram. Yeah. Another guest I've got on tomorrow, Eric Iverson. He's interesting because I met up with him in Canada in person. He gave me body work. We got chatting. Turns out he was one of the original students of Gabrielle Roth. He's got loads of embodiment background. He's very rarely on any kind of media, but he's just an elder and he's just got a lot to say. And I was hanging out with him. And at the end of that, body work followed by a coffee, I kind of went, I want to talk to you more. So I sent him the invite. So there's sort of two quite different ways in. But usually, I'm going, do they basically have something to say? Do I think we're going to vibe well? A lot of it goes on if you vibe well. Like Eric, for example, I just hung out with him. We went dancing together. That's going to be a good conversation. I guarantee it, because you've got a bodied rapport, relationship. When I have Jamie Cato back on, me and him mates, we're going to be taking the piss out of each other, challenging each other, joking all the way through. It's going to be a much better episode than someone who I've never met in person or never worked with before. But equally, I want to give those guys a try. Normally, the only ones I hate are if they're a blagger, if they don't really know their topic. I don't like that. I'm like, you shouldn't be setting yourself up on the internet if you don't know your topic, Or if they're too salesy. Like some of them I feel don't want to have a conversation. They want to do a sales. Nini always American. And I don't mind people sharing at the end where people can find out more about them. That's fine. Of course, that's why they come on, right? It's a big reason for it. But when they do it all the way through, everything's often with a certain kind of American, everything's an angle. And there's no
sort of getting out to us. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like there's no actual dialogue. There's no creative meeting of minds. It's just them throwing pre-recorded fucking advertising at you.
Yeah.
And the stories advertising. It's like, it's not just they're saying buy my product. It's like their whole life story is one plastic product.
There is sort of probably this kind of just marketing school that goes this way. It's just the whole thing is just presenting the product you're selling. So not even thinking about the biggest thing I learned from you is looking what is the service that I'm doing to the person. So as you say, what is the service of this podcast? What am I giving to the person?
And actually they're missing a trick because people feel it, particularly Europeans, and our podcast audience is nearly 50% European, right? If you add up, I could show you the data about the different countries. So it's a big American audience, but it's a big Euro audience. And they feel it. And the other thing is like the most impressive you can ever be is just by giving maximum value anyway. Like just being generous and giving value. And I think there's a sort of acceptable middle ground. I kind of do this a bit myself when I'm a guest, which is you genuinely engage and connect with the person, but you just hold in the background that you've also got a company that needs to pay the bills. You know what I mean? You just sort of hold in the background that because someone might get really interested in Ukraine, and that's great. I'm happy to talk about that, but it's not the main thing I do, right? Mm-hmm. So at some point I'll bring in embodied coaching, which I'm also passionate about, and it's my business. So it's just kind of remembering what your actual business is the sort of very light version of that.
Yeah. In the end, after all, I mean, the thing that we give is one thing is on the podcast, you can give a lot of interesting information, but the thing that we live on, our business is actually giving something to people. So if we are not able to connect with people, right, it's really hard to be of service, right? So in a way, being aware of that. One idea that, and I know that it's something that you contemplated, is sort of this teacher dilemma, master on a hill or like a rock star person who is going around and doing workshops and stuff. So sort of withdrawing and having a small circle of people that you give your content to, or being omnipresent and going around and doing workshops. Where do you stand on that now? What is your...
I'm not sure I understand what you mean, Ranko. Like, I mean, I try and do breadth and depth, right? So there's a few students who I really try and train, like, you know, the mentee group. And then there's the people, the breadth of things like the podcast. I think we're on 1.2 million downloads last I checked. You know, it's just a huge reach, which I think is really important as well. And for me, I get the greatest satisfaction from a mixture of those two. And also those two relate. Like, I have to have 1 million podcast hits to have 20 students who are willing to fly across the world for an intensive, right? So does that answer your question, or did I not quite get that? Sort
of. Just this kind of being in the, like, going around the world, doing the workshops every other weekend and stuff, or withdrawing to a small place that you actually live in now, and I've been able to visit, and sort of drawing the ones that are really interested to go deeply and intensely. So
yeah, I mean, there's embodiment teachers sort of parachuting into different cities. Like, I was just in Montreal, for example. I'm in Barcelona this weekend, Tallinn and Slovenia by the end of the month. It's sort of fun and exotic and sexy, but often it's just tiring. And I think the other thing is, like, everyone can be awesome for a day or a week. And real community, people really see who you really are, and you're held accountable. And, you know, I was hanging out with someone last night, and I live in a small town now, and I was just acutely aware that it's like, okay, this person knows a lot of people in this tiny town, and you have to be really accountable, which is a positive thing in many ways. You know, it can feel a bit stifling. So I'm very drawn to maybe having, you know, we're going to do a course here next year, which is just in the same place every month for 6 months. You know, because I want to get a dog, Ranko, obviously the important stuff. And, you know, but there's definitely something in real community that's not online, that's not dispersed, that's in person. You know, I'm just about to go to a sauna with someone locally who does men's stuff, who I'm befriending and building connections with. You know, that's very different. And it's also weird when the two collide, right? Like, we did a dance class here the other day, and all of a sudden I've got 20 students from Kuwait, America, and they're like, who are you? You know, they're like, who the hell is this guy in a dirty hoodie? You know? So that's kind of weird. But I think some combination thereof is the future.
Do you see there is a sort of going from the role of teacher to the role of elder in the community?
I mean, I'm not old enough to be an elder, really. I'm still in the teacher mode.
Like a transition, sort of.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just growing into middle age, so let me get used to that before I become an elder. You know, I'm still kind of figuring out, because I've gone from the sort of, I mean, the embodiment conference is when I went from sort of enfant terrible kind of young bad boy to like establishment figure, and part of the problems I had with it.
Mr. Embodiment, after all. I mean, This is something that's stuck on you. And also is, how is it to be Mr. Embodiment? Like you say, you come to yoga classes, somebody says, are you Mark Walsh? Well, of course. I mean, you are the Mr. Embodiment. So why wouldn't
I had one in Brighton. I was putting yoga mat blocks away after yoga. And somebody said, and I put the yoga blocks away, not neat enough for someone's liking. And they said, oh, I thought you were Mr. Embodiment. And I was like, I'm just trying to do yoga on a Monday night to relax, And so it's sometimes a bit much. I mean, I very much say it like in inverted commas, right? I mean, first of all, people started calling me that in interviews, just to be clear. People would say, I remember one German friend of mine got very upset with me. She said, who are you to say you're Mr. Embodiment? And I'm saying, look, I'm not saying I'm the most embodied person or the best embodiment teacher even. But I did, do the podcast, write the book, do the conference. I could list off a series of things that have made it a more known word than it used to be, had the world not But I don't have any sense that I'm like the man in it. That would be ridiculous. It's interesting. I had coffee or lunch a few days ago with a local conscious dance teacher, Sophie Bolton. She's very good, actually. And I met her as she's about my age. She's a good conscious dance teacher. I really like her class. And I just had a sense, that we're peers. And that's how I relate to a lot of people in the embodiment world, like many guests. Interestingly, often guests are surprised that I know something about embodiment, or they're surprised that I know about yoga or meditation or something. They think maybe I'm just a conference organizer or a podcast host. So that's also kind of weird. They don't realize that primarily I'm an embodiment geek. I'm a practitioner. I'm not primarily a podcast host, or I don't have any interview training.
And I mean, you've got how many, 20 plus years behind you of working in embodiment? Not how much is it?
Yeah, 25 years. I started teaching something as soon as I started doing Aikido at 18, and certainly well over 10,000 hours, maybe 20,000 hours of teaching experience.
So in the period that I have you on radar, which is maybe some 16 years ago, that when I saw something like that, when you were, I think, Ethiopia, or stuff. So going from working with corporate world, then going into teaching, and then now teaching teachers and teaching coaches, how would you describe this kind of journey? What was the thing that was pushing to the next level?
Well, I just like variety, so I'd always try and work with different groups. And in a way, it doesn't really matter to me. I don't really notice if I'm working with oligarch millionaires in Moscow, street kids in Brazil or Ethiopia, coaches in Brighton, yoga teachers in London. I don't care. It's all sort of the same. I mean, from my point of view, it's all just people and embodiments. So it's just like different sexual positions with your wife. You know what I mean? It's just variety.
Well, there's some position, and then there are other positions. So.
Yeah, you might have a favorite position for a year or a month or something, but do you know what I mean? It's just. I hope that analogy it's not too crude, but it's just that I love doing embodiment work, so I don't really mind who I'm doing it with. I might have a preference for a while. I learned a lot from business people. And then at a certain point, I'd assimilated it, and then it just became boring that they were a bit harder to work with than, say, coaches who are a bit more open-minded, because I had learned all those lessons, But I'll still love working with the new group. If somebody said to me, do I want to work with, hitmen? And I've never worked with hitmen before. I'd be well up for it,
It's a niche, interesting niche. It's kind of morality thing.
But just so there's very few groups I haven't worked with. I got an invite from CERN the other day, and I didn't take it in the end. But that was okay, this is interesting. Do I want to go to CERN? And then actually, I looked at it and went, it doesn't actually look that interesting. But it was, I've always just been interested to work with different people and understand embodiment thoroughly by approaching it from different angles, I guess, was the motivation.
Yeah, the thing that I notice as a mentee is basically at this level that there is a lot of meta, so many levels when you're teaching. It's not just I'm teaching embodiment, but I'm teaching embodiment, how I'm teaching embodiment, and look at this, and so many different nuances that it's I guess it gets more exciting than just teaching some business person how to like be a better leader or whatever.
Yeah, it's like, here's your, sorry, that's my lift. They're about to pick me up in a minute. So let me. Hello,
How
mate.
many minutes? Actually, how many minutes do we have? Sorry.
We're almost out of time, I'm afraid. So I left my phone on. That's very unprofessional.
Yeah, I have just one question for the end, and it's really something that I would like to, maybe not short one, but what do you see as challenges and benefits, like opportunities of embodiment nowadays? Because a lot of things are changing and rapidly, and just maybe a sentence or two, or I know it's a question for another chapter, but
I think my lift has got a flat tire, so we might have plenty of time.
Great.
In that case, he's just always calling me. Okay, yeah, we've got plenty of time. It's got a flat tire. Great. So in that case, have you got any other questions before that? Is that the final one, or is there more?
No, actually, one before that is. It seems that like trauma is really getting like a big thing now, and a lot of sort of trauma superstars are appearing on the horizon. Some that are there for quite a long time. So how do you see yourself in this kind of lineup, or what is your position?
Yeah, so there's always trends in embodiment, right? And I've seen plenty come and go. Do you know what I mean? Mindfulness, yoga. Trauma's been a trend the last few years. I think it's peaked in counterculture, and it's now moving into mainstream culture. Like when I saw Gabor Mate do the interview with Prince Harry, I felt very happy on one hand, and I also felt sort of horrified on the other. I was like,
okay, horrified. Well, specifically.
Well, interviewing trauma royals as sort of mass entertainment so he can sell his books.
Well,
I mean, really?
Yeah, being true, you did have a few posts, so also getting a little bit off on that one, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's also interesting. It's interesting a repetition of what his mother did. His mother was actually interviewed by a journalist, and it was sort of before trauma theory was well known, but it was a very psychological interview, which was quite unusual at the time in British culture, certainly for the royal to speak about that. And I think it also represents the sort of public American-style confessional culture of sort of bearing of one's soul. You know, it's sort of Prince Harry's like I actually quite like Prince Harry in many ways from what I know about him. He's done some good stuff, so I don't want to be too hard on him. But that like leave us alone, but actually I want to be interviewed about all my trauma. And you know, it's sort of him and his wife talking about their difficulties, and it's very interesting on the one hand to see sort of hyper rich people talk about the awfuls that the intersectional kind of narrative has got even to the very highest upper classes, you know?
Yeah.
Actually, I think Prince Harry is a really interesting case study of why intersectionality and the current kind of neo-Marxist narrative around privilege doesn't work, because he's white, male, and upper class.
Quite upper, like upper.
As upper class as you absolutely could be, right?
Yeah.
Like, but his mum died in a car accident when he was a kid. So how would you possibly balance those two in terms of privilege? You can't. You absolutely can't. Any attempt to would be immoral.
Yeah, like there are some things that are just objectively, you cannot put them in a different levels just because somebody is rich or whatever.
But then when you start realizing that, you realize that everyone's life is like that. Everyone's life is some combination of things that may have been an advantage, things that were almost certainly an advantage, like being a royal. But even being a royal, that comes with a really heavy responsibility, and it comes with you're always in the public eye. And
there's some limitation, like how private can you be and stuff like that. Yeah.
And then there's his wife who's kind of saying that, you know, she's incredibly privileged in many ways financially, in terms of like, you know, she's married a prince, so she, you know, it's just, but yeah, and she's black. So, okay, how would you measure that? How would you weigh that up? Yeah. And I think it sort of shows the ridiculousness of the whole thing. You've got incredibly rich people complaining about their privilege, complaining about their hardship to people that are actually really poor. And I've seen
actually
this,
poor people buying the book and reading it, and that's the weird thing.
So I think the trauma narrative, particularly through this sort of neo-Marxist intersectional lens, is imploding. And I think it deserves to, and it's ridiculous. I think it's also become, we've lowered the bar on trauma. We've really lowered the bar on trauma. And that was a good thing in many ways, but it's also led to, like, when I went to Ukraine, I messaged a load of really high-level trauma teachers. I won't name names, but some pretty big ones because I have access to them. And some of them said, oh, I don't know anything about that. I just deal with Californian problems.
Yeah.
And so it's like, well, hang on a minute. You're supposed to be the world's expert on trauma, and no advice for me going to a war zone? I mean, there were exceptions like David Baselli, who done a lot of humanitarian work, and, he can speak to that. So I've, on the one hand, I'm dealing with hyper-privileged customers who are very wealthy and have been learning about the intricacies of their, intergenerational trauma. And on the other hand, I'm talking to Ukrainians on a near daily basis. And it's like I can hear explosions in the background while they're leaving me voice messages and stuff. So it's just pretty an interesting juxtaposition. And I think something's going to crack in trauma. I think the whole field needs to be rethought, really. I no longer think it's the sort of lead edge, as it were. But also, I'm certainly very glad that people have brought, the Bezelman de Kolks and the Pete Levines, the Gabors, they've brought trauma into the public light for many in a way that when I started the podcast, let alone when I started my career, I couldn't have imagined. Personally, for me, I'm not that interested in talking to people about trauma on the podcast now, unless they've got a unique angle to it, or there's something where I go, okay, there's a group, for example, like there's whole ethnic groups that just don't have any trauma work done on them. Like, I've never seen anything done on trauma on the Irish. There's only a few of my colleagues in Ukraine and Russia that have had the Slavic experience of trauma.
Yeah.
For my colleague Patricia Aguirre, there would be almost nothing on Latino experience. And I've talked to her about it, and I was very happy to talk to her because it was like, okay, I'm learning something here. And that is actually the most underprivileged group in America. If you go to the United States, they're the people standing on street corners hoping to get picked up for cash in hand work. They're the real underclass. So, there's just these massive, or Indians, like, where's the stuff on India? Where's the stuff on Japan? So this big blind spot. Yeah. So I'm always open to if there's something kind of new there. And I think the people in the trauma world have become kind of barons. Some of them, frankly, aren't very nice when the camera's off. Some of them are. Stephen Porges is lovely, for example. And I think sometimes like the power's gone to their head a little bit. They're pretty wealthy people, and it would be hard not to. So they never expected to be celebrities.
It's kind of weird.
Now you've got trauma celebrity. Bizarre. I mean, Paul Linden, my teacher, was telling me about trauma 15, 20 years ago. And I remember thinking, oh, this is just some minority thing,
And he is actually like a mathematician. He's not somebody who is from the branch, right?
No, he's got his own particular take, which is because of the martial arts stuff that's a bit different as well. So you've got these kind of weird cul-de-sacs in the trauma world, or sort of popping up in different places. So, that's trauma anyway.
Yeah, we can move away from trauma. It's traumatic, kind of.
Boring. It's not traumatic.
It's boring because, as you said, it's all over the place now. Everything is
all
trauma.
over the place, and it's so middle class, and it's just posh kids arguing about who had it worse. Now, I mean, the project I'm most interested in around trauma, it would be I'm in the very early stages of talking to a bunch of nuns in Ukraine about a project for returning soldiers from the war. In terms of how they reintegrate into society. So, there's some stuff I'm very interested in the trauma world, but in terms of arguing about which ethnic group had it worse, I can't be bothered anymore.
And it's really the thing you told me about actually structure, working with the soldiers as the war goes on the trauma is something that is totally. We had a war like 30 years ago, and we still got PTSD guys who are just drinking in the neighborhoods. So basically addressing it while it happens, and also like what you said, returning and integrating. This is, I think, it's not exciting. It's really something that should be happening because it's so much going into the preventing of repeating of something like that.
Well, it's a breakthrough in human history.
Yeah.
So the only people that have had a continuous experience with trauma and still had an infrastructure and therefore had the ability to build on knowledge are the Israelis. They're uniquely positioned in that they have a war every 10 years, but they still have universities and things, not like the Congo, you know, where they just don't have that kind of infrastructure or knowledge base, plus Jewish cultural traditions around psychology. So Israel's one interesting point, and Ukraine's another, because it's a war where trauma is being acknowledged from the start, 20 years later. And, you know, the same Ukraine team have done wonderful things there, and I'm very proud of them. And sometimes I worry about them a bit. They're getting a bit brave now, and they're going a bit close to the front lines, so sometimes daddy worries, you know. But it's back to daddy issues. But, yeah. I stopped them calling me trauma daddy, Ranko. That sounded way too weird. So,
that's weird.
I was like, no, this is not appropriate. No.
There has to be a line.
There's a line there.
Okay, so let's move to the brighter things. So
yeah.
what do you see as like the biggest challenges and biggest opportunities in embodiment nowadays?
Yeah, I mean, challenge, I still think the woke takeover of embodiment is still a real issue. It's places like Berlin, you know, and California, it's a real threat, I would say. And it just means that people end up in these very intellectual arguments and no one's really practicing, and perfectly good practitioners are alienated. And certainly there's a very negative impact on women, for example, I've been very aware of for a while. And yeah, I think that's one threat. Over commercialization, you know, that happened to mindfulness, the MOOC mindfulness movement. I think the disguising of very sort of almost pornographic visual imagery as embodiment. If you go to Instagram and put in
the yoga embodiment,
the girls on beaches, you know, which, you know, is fine if you want kind of softcore porn, but it's not really embodiment work. And sort of disguising that in a sort of fake feminist narrative, like, who are you to body shame women? I'm not doing that. So it's a very interesting one to unpick, because if you critique it, you get accused of sort of being anti-women or anti, you know, body shamer of some kind. But yeah, so I think that's another interesting one. I mean, just generally in the world, global sort of Mad Max economic collapse kind of thing, you know, that's a potential. World War III, kind of the collapse of infrastructure, meaning embodiment doesn't become a priority. Will be,
actually, like a sub question, if you will. I see myself as I do embodiment. It's sort of on top of the feeding chain, because we are something like extra. It's not an essential. It's not food. It's not water. So basically, if most of, and now also touching on your like socialist, leftist. So how do you actually be of most help to the people who need it most when they actually cannot afford it? Yeah, and embodiment is getting expensive, right?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you know, things like the podcast, right? So we have a freemium model that's very deliberately there, A, because it's a decent marketing model, but also because it means that anyone who's totally broke but really interested in my work can get a lot for free. Yeah. You know, and then there's charities I support, like say in Ukraine, they get funding and they get grants from the Red Cross or the government or whatever. But yeah, I think the freemium model is one. The second thing I would say, though, is we live in a world which is very antagonistic to mental and emotional well-being, like by far the most in human history. And like we're in a world now which is really making people mentally unwell. And levels of mental ill health are ridiculous, and in young people seem even higher. And I think given the crazy making nature of the world, having things that keep you sane is no longer a luxury. And I think that means that people prioritize them. And yes, certainly if I settle down where I am now, like low cost community level access stuff, like someone's asked me locally to do a thing for young boys who don't have enough male role models. And there's like a bunch of sort of single mothers who have decided I'm a good masculine role model, which is very sweet of them.
Yeah, it doesn't happen. Yeah, I know.
And they've been smart enough to realize that they can't give boys everything they need, even though they would if they could. And they're doing their best. So they've asked me to do a local group. And, you know, when I stop traveling a bit, I might well do that, for example. So I think embodiment teachers doing sort of grassroots, you know, I won't take any money for that, right? Like it might be a donation from their parents, maybe, if that. So I think the sort of grassroots stuff I kind of go, if you're a rock star embodiment teacher doing Zoom workshops, but you're not teaching meditation locally, like, why not? Do you know what I mean? Like it's not that hard. And for me, that's just a great way of being. I want to be involved in the local community because I understand that is, in terms of where the world could be heading, that's incredibly useful. Like 10 years from now, after the apocalypse, one of these women's going to be sewing me a blanket to keep me warm when the heating gets cut off, one of our sons will be protecting me from roving bands of marauders when I'm an old man, So
yeah, that's an angle to see it, yeah.
I'm investing in the future. So do you see what I mean? I'm only half joking when I say that. We don't know. The world's, we could be in for a really difficult period. And I think people are waking up to that. But then again, never has embodiment been so widely available. I think the things like the podcast, if many ways, the biggest problem people have is there's too much good stuff. Like I've got too many good podcasts downloaded on my phone to listen to. My favorite one's The Emerald at the moment. I want to give a shout out to, I think I have the second best embodiment podcast now. The Emerald is far better than mine.
Yeah, it's so like the production is so,
It's a work of art. But the difference is I make 8 a month and he makes 1.
Yeah,
so he's gone for art and I've gone for quantity and outreach. So, and both of those are valid. I mean, in some ways I'm jealous not to be an artist, and we're actually thinking of doing an episode that takes a month. But what it will mean is we'll only have 1 episode that month.
Yeah, but my wife commented that he's almost like, when Orson Welles made the War on the Worlds, it was this kind of thing, everything sounds like you're in it. It's happening.
It's amazing. And I think there's space for that. But I've gone for like, hey, I just want to talk to lots of cool people. Not necessarily that kind of. The poetry of his I resonate with. I might start doing more poetical stuff because that's always been a side of my character. And I think mine would be more like comedy, poetry, provocations and fun with it, rather than his is like deep, meaningful, very connected. I was listening to one about the moon while walking, late last night and through the night sky, and it's it's very beautiful, and stuff can still be done creatively. In some ways, I think an intelligent, rational approach to irrational mysticism and animism, that might be the new lead edge for embodiment. It's always been part of my character. Like British counterculture is enmeshed with paganism. Like Stonehenge is 50 miles away, not even that, 30 miles away from where I am right now. Right. So it's like British paganism is just enmeshed. If you go to a Buddhist festival, there's loads of pagan stuff going on in Britain. So it's like, that's not some weird, kooky, teenager in California doing Wicca. That's here. My school did maypole dances when I was a kid. That's a pagan fertility festival, So I think that might be a lead edge, and that's something which excites me as a possibility, the sort of reintegration of the best of sort of tribal understandings without the sort of hippie romanticization of that. Which is often the case, put a feather in your hair and think you're a Native American kind of thing. So I think that's pretty interesting as a lead edge. I don't think neuroscience is the lead edge. I think it continuously thinks it is. And often it's really just bullshit. It's really just people trying to make an authority claim. I'm continuously unimpressed with people that have neuroscience backgrounds who come on the show. There's the odd one that I think is good. But often
maybe if you get Andrew Huberman, maybe it's going to change a little bit.
Huberman I would have on. I like him. But even him, sometimes I'm going, it's like a priest cast. So back in the day, the priests would say, listen, I've spoken to God. Or I speak Latin. It's like the new Latin.
Yes, he's sort of like, this is how it is.
Yeah, because I've read the Latin text that you peasants haven't. I'm not saying he seems like a nice guy, and it's often, I take some of his advice, like early morning walks to get light in your eye. That's a thing I do every day that I took directly from his advice, and I found out, this actually makes a difference. I was like, wow, this is true. And I think, going beyond bro science into sort of, I think, like, I'll give you an example. I haven't seen an empirical study on centering techniques. Now, I'm not going to do one because I'm not an academic, but I would love someone to go and test 50 different centering techniques and say which works best.
And not only but testing different like calibration and stuff, and see how it actually can change the state. Because like empirically we can, I know it works, but if you can really do it in a scientific way, it would change the perception, right?
Yeah, so I think that embodiment, what's happened to mindfulness could happen to embodiment with studies, but I think it's so difficult because there's really interesting like replication issues. I've seen stuff around Amy Cuddy's research, for example, where the people replicating it just were doing totally different poses and they didn't even realize it. You know, there's a subtlety there that's a bit tricky. So I think that's potentially a lead edge, though I'm not super convinced. I think the sort of neuroactive stuff is interesting, like headbands which change your brain waves, not just measure them. You know, I'm not a huge, like I wear this, I look at my heart rate variability or my heart rate, and that's kind of interesting, but I've come to the conclusion that biohacking is not really a replacement for actually being in contact with your body. It may be a nice,
like being able to influence by yourself, right? Using the tools of embodiment to, why going for the technology when basically we can do a lot of it ourselves, right?
Yeah, or it's one more way to be disconnected and not actually be in contact.
Yeah.
The other thing I'd say is that AI kind of potentially huge impact on the field. And that could put a premium on anyone doing hands-on work. So what we could be looking at within 2 years is anyone that has an information-based job is unemployed.
Yeah.
So let's just slow that down a little bit. Anyone who has an information-based job. So if you're a lawyer who gives advice, that's an information-based job. Yeah. If you're a doctor who doesn't touch people, that's an information-based job. Do you see what I mean? It's like everything that isn't physically touching someone. So a plumber, that's not an information-based job. So a plumber doesn't.
They're still there. They're going to be there. Yeah.
So it could be that, like plumbers, because robot plumbers are a long way off. It's actually quite tricky to make a robot that can go under a tap and into a wrench. It might be that we actually become at a premium. And it also might be that because video is going to get so untrustworthy, I mean, a year from now, I won't know if I'm talking to Ranko or an AI Ranko.
Yeah.
I have no idea. It will literally be like maybe maximum 2 years from now, someone can take all the Rankos on you from your Facebook videos,
photographs, and some.
And I will literally have no idea who I'm speaking to, the real one or the artificial one. So that could create a collapse in the real, which is already happening in postmodern culture. But the positive is the swing back from that means that face-to-face, physical, embodied interaction could all of a sudden become a massive premium again. Who knows? Yeah. Let's see. Let's see.
Sounds good.
I'm going to keep teaching embodiment until the AI robot overlords destroy me and Skynet puts me in a camp. You know? Like that's I'll still be doing it as long as possible.
It's with this sort of the question, parallel last question, the future of embodiment as you see it is being tackled. But do you have something like to wrap it up? Is where do you see your work is going and where do you see the field is going?
Yeah, I mean the podcast, let's start there. So this is episode 500. Which is amazing. I just want to thank the other hosts, people like Karin and Patricia and Christina. In the background, Zeba's just done a load of work, and the different tech people who have done the editing for each one. We deliberately do it fairly low, not low quality, because I think the guests, 90% of the quality is the guest, right? But we deliberately do it so that we can make it relatively cheaply, so we don't have to have advertising. So there's no other interests involved. Right? There's no corporate sponsors. Like when Huberman does his Athletic Greens thing, I just trust him a bit less because I go, okay, he's been paid to say that, And now I go, is Athletic Greens good or not? I don't know because this guy's being paid, So we don't, that's the wonderful freedom we have that I can just keep saying my opinions and swearing and having whatever guest the fuck I want on, So I think that's wonderful. And that will continue. I said I'd give it to episode 1000, which is probably another 3 or 4 years. And we're re-releasing some for the Embodiment Conference and other events that will continue. We will have guest people interviewing, so it's not just my voice. Though actually, it's quite hard to get other people to do that, So it's not that we don't want, say, Karin or Christina to do podcasts, but they're just less available, and you know what I mean. It's just harder to get hold of them. But that will continue. You will see trends, things that I'm interested in. We'll have a load of guests, and I think we're going to get bigger and bigger guests as now Zeba's really professionalizing her. She's learned so much the last year about how to get guests on, how to email them. This is an art form. How to get in touch with someone famous is an art form. I'll give you an example. Esha Perel, we just sent an email to, right? If we get no response, we're sending a dozen red roses to her office. Like this is the kind of thing you have to do.
Total sense.
Let's be creative. Let's send her flowers. Who doesn't like flowers? If that doesn't work, we'll see if we know somebody knows her, So it's not easy. It's not easy, but we're getting better at that. So I think you'll see bigger guests as well as very obscure ones I just happen to know. In terms of my homework, we'll continue to do coach training. That's our bread and butter. We've got a live coach training course coming up. So doing it in person, not just on the internet, that's the sort of latest, the return to real life. We'll continue to the online coach training because it's good for people in obscure locations. It spreads the learning out nicely.
Yeah, spreading the learning is actually like a big thing.
Yeah,
right?
That's like the problem because we used to do face-to-face, and the problem is everyone just gets overwhelmed.
You have to do it in 5 days, and then people are just
everyone's overwhelmed if they're flying in because you can't have a day on, day off because they're flown in. They've got days off work. So we're going to do some face-to-face again, and we're looking at different ways to do that, like a British option, a Euro option, and ways that have a bit of online to spread out the learning a little bit. So, we're just trying to find the impossible, which is the perfect format for an embodied coach training. And I think, tech as it is world-class. It just stands up as a coach training.
I've been through it for 2 or 3 times now. I'm assisting and teaching a little bit, and I can say that really every time it's giving more. So really
it's getting better every year as well, right? So it's already I'd say if anyone wants to be an embodiment coach, sadly, since Wendy Palmer passed away, there's really only a couple of options. And the other option's not bad. Like my friend Tessify works for Strozzi Institute and they do good courses, if you want to go out to California or whatever. They're not bad, but Dylan is a friend of mine. He does very good courses as well. But there's not that many of us who are really offering high quality stuff, and we've been doing it a while now, particularly in the online space. So I keep doing that, and then I think if I'm either going to go back to Portugal because the weather's nice, or settle where I am in this little small town in the west of England I'm at now. And if I do, then I might build an embodiment center here, or I might well do much more local stuff like the kids group. I might do an Aikido class again, and I might just get kind of local again because I feel like that's just wholesome and nourishing. You know what I mean? Like I know my neighbors. I know Sue lives next door, and I know Graham, whose Rottweiler, walks by, and I say, and the Rottweiler knows me. Lovely dog. That's really valuable. I know Sophie who runs a conscious dance now. I know Ben who does this. It's that's really valuable. So that might be part of my own future. Is just the sort of nourishment of if I'm either going to do it here or Portugal. I've given myself a year to decide.
Yeah, I know that you've been all over the place. There is actually quite a team. How much does the embodiment of the place you are in influence how you are, how you teach, what you are actually? So
huge. I think the environment does 50% of the heavy lifting, really. I think I've said you this story before. I used to teach in Moscow. Obviously, I don't anymore, but I used to teach there. And then my colleague from Moscow came to visit me in Brighton, where I used to live. And she said, "Oh, you're much nicer in Brighton." And I'm like, "Yeah, I find Moscow stressful. It's 15 million people not smiling at you, And it's a big urban, fast, polluted city. Yeah. And whenever I was in Moscow, even for a week, I'd be stressed. I felt like I'd smoking a cigarette as soon as you wake up. It's polluted, it's the water, it's everything. My skin would get dry there. My mood would change. I'd get more addictive eating patterns. It's really impactful. My trauma would come out because of just the background trauma that's intergenerational there. And, now I'm in the countryside. It's just a different fish. And for me, another thing I've been interested in is I'm indigenous to where I am now. I'm of this land. My people are, Celtic, Anglo-Irish, they've been here a while. Yeah, and you could argue there's been this immigration and the Normans came, the Romans came, but pretty much you're looking at Celtic influence, which still exists in the UK and certainly in Ireland for thousands of years, and Anglo-Saxon influence, pretty much for 1,000 years, right? And like, that's not nothing. And I'm trying to figure out what that is, particularly as I compare it to, say, Portugal. There's an ease and a being of a place, and without sort of going into some sort of far right neo-romantic kind of narrative around it, there's something of an ease in that I didn't feel abroad, even though I prefer the weather maybe abroad, So that's another thing that maybe leans me here that I'm interested in. So yeah, anyway, not much to say, but I just podcast's been useful to people. I hope people have liked it. Instagram is the place to ask me questions. You can suggest guests. The best way to do that is to send me a podcast I've already been on. Feedback always welcome. Sometimes people say your mic's horrible. That normally means I forgot to bring the nice one with me that Z bought me when I went on holiday or something. But Ranko, thanks for being game.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for this opportunity to drill a little bit into you and the podcast and things embodiment.
For me, I can easily say that I'm a podcast person. I can take a couple of hours of my day, go for a walk, do my own thing, and listen to a good conversation that is on the topic of my interest. What I appreciate about Embodiment Podcast and the way Mark does it, that after listening to a certain topic, I find myself having a lot of aha moments in which I notice, and this is how I embody certain skills, this is how I approach certain topics. Is this something of value for me or something that I can change? So in a way, it's like being coached through the podcast often. And on that note, Mark, I want to thank you and congratulate you on your 500th podcast. And I'm looking forward to listening next 500.
In my entire life, I've listened to maybe 25 podcast episodes, not even channels. It's just not my medium. I really fight for that. So maybe half of them have actually been on the Embodiment Unlimited podcast channel. And some of them I have found so interesting and so relevant for myself that I even listened to them twice. I think one of them even 3 times. And it must have been the one talking about Mexican embodiment. It was a conversation between Patricia and Mark. As I love traveling, that was before I went to live in Mexico for 6 months. And that was literally the only preparation I made to completely dive into that culture. And not only for Mexican embodiment, but just the questions that came up there completely shaped the way that I travel through the world now and that I connect with another culture. So, Mark, thanks for that. I'm trying to listen to some more. I know they're all good. Congratulations on number 500.
Back in 2021, you were interviewing my dance teacher, Frey Faust, and it very quickly turned into cat fucking. So thank you for that. If it hadn't been for that, I probably wouldn't be your mentee now, and that would really be too bad. So happy 500th podcast, and thank you so much, Mark.
The Embodiment Podcast got me into podcasting, listening, and even starting my own podcast. I was listening to the Embodiment Podcast since the first episode, and I remember the first year I listened to each episode. It really opened me the doors to understand the vast range and spectrum of embodiment, and got me into new life purpose path. Thank you, Mark, for all your work, all your time, putting your energy into this wonderful free resource that everyone can benefit. And congratulations for your 500th episode.
Right, well, if you like that, you'll probably like embodimentunlimited.com and our app. So on both of these things, you can get a bunch of podcasts that aren't available here, some exclusive ones with some big names, some people you'll probably recognize that are over there. There's a copy of my book, PDF, my first book on embodiment, which seems to people like. I sold quite a few copies on Amazon, but there's a free copy there. What else is there? Loads of videos of me coaching embodiment, resources on trauma, on meditation, on yoga. And you can also chat to people without going on Facebook or any of that nonsense. So if you want to chat embodiment with people, that's there. And it's on the embodimentunlimited.com, all free. and the app available at the App Store and all that good stuff. So if you like this, do check those out.